Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. A warm welcome to all of you for this episode of Avid Learning's ongoing Sustainability Now series. Launched in 2020, Sustainability Now was conceptualized as a platform to engage in conversations regarding dire environmental issues of today with the aim of converting audiences into change makers and catalysts and custodians for a greener future. To date, we presented over 40 episodes in this series on the themes including art and culture, fashion and textile, design and architecture, travel and tourism, food and agriculture, environment and wildlife, technology and innovation, including a children's book and outreach program on coral conservation. The omnipresence of Tesla and other emerging electric vehicles that I noticed during my last couple of visits to the US made me start to think about this topic and its importance. A Reuters article I read yesterday said that Tesla sold over 70,000 vehicles in the month of December to China and exported close to a million vehicles last year. China's electric vehicle sales doubled to 2.9 million last year. Today's discussion is not about Mr. Musk or China, but about India. In 2021, 339,000 electric vehicles were sold in India. India with an increase of 168%. But transport accounts for about 11% of India's carbon emission. With fuel costs soaring day by day, and with the return to normalcy, at least we hope we're going to return one day, people are looking out for sustainable and affordable transportation substitutes. And this brings me to this evening's session. Sustainability Now, the road to eco-transportation. I do feel that a strong shift to a more eco-friendly, low-carbon mobility option is imminent, especially in the face of climate change. But I'm going to leave it in the hands of the panel of experts who we are privileged to have with us here today to share their views on the same. Allow me to give a warm virtual welcome to co-founder of BlueSmart, Puneet Goyal, Principal Secretary and Commissioner Transport, GNTC of Delhi, Ashish Kundra, Program Director, Clean Mobility and Energy Tech at WRI India, Pawan Mulukutla. Pawan will join us shortly. He's at the moment stuck in a meeting, but he will be with us in the next 15 minutes. We also have with us the President of Drone Federation of India, Schmidt Shah, and they will be in conversation with founder of Recreate, Rajiv Ramchandra. These speakers will look at best practices, innovative ways to reduce urban traffic and pollution, the gradual and necessary shift to a zero-emission electric vehicular ecosystem in India, and the potential to leverage drone technology and so much more. Please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning and the bios of our very impressive speakers for today. They should have also been emailed to you earlier. This session will last 75 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A, in which Raji will be taking questions. So do keep your questions posted and keep posting them throughout the session. Don't wait for the end. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in. Over to you, Rajiv, and look forward to an exciting session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asad, for your very warm welcome. A very warm welcome to all of our panelists as well as the audience members joining us. I'm going to keep my opening remarks brief. What I will say is that I've had the opportunity and privilege of talking to our panelists beforehand. And it's going to be a very interesting conversation that's going to unfold today, at least in my opinion. Primarily because they're engaged in such inspiring work across the spectrum, especially from the perspective of eco-transportation or sustainable mobility. Some of you might be familiar with the concept of sustainable mobility or eco-transportation, especially in the urban context, and a lot of the conversation tends to center around electric vehicles, which is certainly something that we'll talk about today. But it's worthwhile to kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the broad landscape of sustainable mobility and eco-transportation from the vantage point that it's a systems issue and the solutions need to be systemic, which is to say that the design of urban infrastructure, cities, the way things are planned matter as much as the technology and the solutions that are deployed. So it's not just about electric vehicles. It's ranges from having infrastructure in place that enables mobility as simple as walking, all the way to drone technology, which has its utility, which we'll get into a little bit with some of the work that Smith is doing. So that being said, I'm going to invite each of our panelists for the next few minutes to talk a little bit about themselves and their organizations and the work that they've been doing. And then we'll get into kind of a round robin discussion where we'll cover thematically 4 to 5 areas, looking at things like the policy landscape, the enabling factors, the relevance of it all in making eco-transportation more mainstream. We'll certainly look at technology aspects and how that shapes the future and what that means from a solutions perspective. The exciting parts are the real world applications. And so what does all of this look like from the standpoint of actual deployment? What are we looking at from a time frame perspective? Who's involved? What needs to shift? And in the space of startups and innovations, again, very rich and diverse landscape to talk about, especially in the space of drone technology with unique case applications. And lastly, towards the end, as we're coming to a close, I certainly welcome any questions that arise by virtue of the conversation that unfolds. But I'd like us to end at the point of, where to from here. What does the future look like? What does 2022 look like? Where are we going from the standpoint of goals from the 2030 timeframe of the Sustainable Development Goals deadline, as well as the challenge of climate mitigation. So framing it from that vantage point, let's move over to get our panelists talking a little bit about themselves and their organization. So let's start with Puneet, the co-founder of BlueSmart. If you could tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, what BlueSmart is about in just a few minutes, that'd be terrific.
So thank you so much, Rajiv and Asad, for this evening. So hi, everyone. I'm the co-founder of BlueSmart. Our goal at BlueSmart, it was very simple. We wanted to decarbonize mobility in mega cities of India, and we started off in 2019 in Delhi. Prior to founding BlueSmart, my co-founder Anmol and myself, we have been serial entrepreneurs in the clean tech space. So we built we built about 100, 200 megawatt solar power plants in India over the last 10 years. And we played some role in accelerating the adoption of clean energy in India. But we really wanted to address this massive challenge of, rising air pollution levels in cities like Delhi NCR. We founded BlueSmart in 2019 with a fleet of 70 electric cars. Today, we have a fleet of 700 plus electric cars in Delhi NCR. But while we decongest cities and increase our fully electric ride-hailing fleet, we're also trying to build an EV ecosystem. So today, we also have 300 fast charging stations in Delhi NCR, which are actually EV super hubs. So we have created 5, 6 large EV super hubs. At each EV super hub, you can park and charge more than 100 cars at one go, which is a global first in the EV ecosystem. BlueSmart has the largest EV super hubs in the world. While we decongest cities and try to improve the air quality of Delhi NCR, we are also making a customer first approach. We launched the industry first features of zero ride denials and zero surge pricing. Since launch, BlueSmart has now covered 30 million kilometers or 3 crore emission-free kilometers. None of the BlueSmart cars emit any emission. These are zero tailpipe emission cars. We have now completed 1 million trips on roads of Delhi NCR. I think we haven't scratched the surface as yet. These are very early days. We encourage all modes of public transportation in Delhi NCR to go fully electric. I think together, as a society, as a community, we all are working towards it. BlueSmart is playing a very small part. We're very happy to accelerate the adoption of EV mobility in Delhi NCR and other parts of India. And we're trying to do our bit here. And I look forward to meeting everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Puneet. Smith, it'd be lovely to hear a little bit about what you're doing with the Drone Federation of India and what that landscape looks like, just in a few sentences or a few minutes. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Asad, and thanks, Rajiv. I hope I'm audible. Cool. So at Drone Federation of India, we are an industry body. We represent about 200 organizations in the country. These are mostly drone manufacturers, drone service providers, and drone training schools, and more than 2,000 drone pilots, which would consist of your average Joe, which is doing wedding photography, to a person who's flying the drones for delivery. The recent healthcare delivery trials, if you've been following the news, is also the diverse set of use cases in which drones are being used. So those are the 2,000 odd individuals that we represent. And our function is more to empower businesses and build the overall ecosystem as such for drones. Now, we do this through a step-by-step approach. So we work on 5 areas. First one is policy advocacy, where we work with the government. I myself am a part of multiple committees under the central government for drones, and we advise the government and we support the government in terms of various public policy interventions, whether it's the rules for flying drones, as well as some financial incentives for different businesses and organizations that are building drones or doing businesses around drones. So that's the first part. Then we do trade promotion activities, which is more about promoting the use of drones and making sure that the drone concept can move right from aerial cinematography to this vision of, drones could also be used for delivering medicines, or they could also be used as air taxis itself. Why would you want to have a helicopter pilot in the helicopter? Why can't the helicopter fly on its own? So these are the kind of work that we do. And then we obviously have other verticals like skill development, certification. And we do all of this through a very community-driven approach. So we have all our members, we take their inputs, and then we take those inputs and build consensus in the community. We want to ensure that if the industry naturally could have progressed in about 10 years or so, what the industry could do naturally in 10 years, we want to do that in about 4 or 5 years of time. So we play the role of an accelerator, and we bring about consensus in the ecosystem. And usually we are like the dot connector, and we execute a lot of stuff as well. I'll come to more of these ideas in the later part of the conversation today. Thanks, Rajiv. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. No, that's great. Thank you so much, Smith. No, and just as you were talking about, being an accelerator, that's exactly what came to mind as you were, mentioning, because you're working across a diverse set of stakeholders. So very interesting work. Awesome. So I'm just looking, I see Pavan isn't on yet, but I think Ashish, if you could tell us a little bit about the really groundbreaking work that you've been engaged in the Delhi area, especially around EVs. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So I am Ashish Kundra. I am Principal Secretary and Commissioner Transport, Government of Delhi. As you are aware, that transport is one of the largest sectors in any urban environment, and especially so in Delhi. And my role relates to operation, relates to policy, relates to regulation of the transport sector. And so therefore it's a 3-in-1 kind of a thing, along with of course planning for and investments in public transport infrastructure, including buses and other kinds of last mile connectivity solutions. Recent times, since 2020, we have kind of been focusing hugely on transition to electric vehicles. And Delhi was, in a way, the lighthouse city for rollout of the electric vehicle policy, which has been replicated and, let's say, amplified in other parts of the country. And in the last 1.5 years, we have seen considerable movement on that space, whether it is private vehicles or it is fleet owners such as BlueSmart who are present here. I think as we go along, we'll have a more focused conversation on issues which arise out of this discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. No, thank you, Ashish. Actually, Ashish, if I could stay with you, just from framing the whole sustainable mobility, eco-transportation ecosystem, that kind of worldview. Could you talk a little bit about what that landscape looks like from the policy perspective, just a little bit deeper? You talked about things like encouraging greater adoption, especially in the public infrastructure area. as well as policy and regulation. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like in terms of what's happening now, in terms of, say, numbers, volume adoption, what incentives might be already in place or coming down the pike from the government?
Yeah, so I think let's first of all put it in the context in the larger context of pollution and environmental sustainability. And as all of you are aware that year on year come winter and Delhi, is in the eye of the storm. A lot of public opinion gets mobilized against, let's say, the decision makers and others on why we can't deal with pollution. One of the major contributing factors for pollution in Delhi has been vehicular emissions. And of course, much has changed in the last 30 years, ever since we made a transition from diesel to CNG for public transport. So, 30 years ago, you would drive around in Delhi and, your eyes would water and your white shirt would be black by the end of the day. And things have changed. But having said that, I think the goalposts have shifted and the expectations are much more. And to that extent, I think the electric mobility becomes a centerpiece of our interventions from a larger sustainability standpoint. Apart from the fact that we are trying to kind of encourage a modal shift from personal vehicle to public transport. And so I think if we look at it from the larger picture policy standpoint, what is happening is that on one hand, Government of India is kind of incentivizing OEMs to kind of catalyze demand and bridge the gap, the cost gap between the internal combustion engine kind of vehicles and electric vehicles. So the FAME 2, FAME 1 and then FAME 2 scheme, which was rolled out by the Ministry of Heavy Industry. And now more recently, the production-linked incentive schemes, which have been announced in the budget, have kind of created the positive mood in industry to kind of switch towards electric manufacturing. And you can see every second day in newspapers, in business newspapers at least, to see some new companies announcing plans to now start production of electric vehicles. On the second side, I think state governments like ours are kind of topping this up with purchase incentives. So we had the EV policy in which we gave incentives for two-wheelers and for four-wheelers, etc., and e-rickshaws for people to ramp up the purchases. And I think I'm happy to share with you that, in the last quarter of the calendar year 2021, in fact, the EV sales were more than 8.5% in Delhi. And December alone, more than 10% of vehicles sold were electric vehicles in Delhi. And I think the numbers on two-wheelers are particularly encouraging. In the last 1 year, 24%, there has been a 24% growth in sale of electric vehicle, electric two-wheelers in Delhi. So I think that those are encouraging kind of numbers. The other thing which we are trying to do is to kind of create, public charging infrastructure, because, that is one big thing which is kind of, let us say, a bottleneck for people to make this transition. And they feel that there's a range anxiety that how far will my vehicle go on a single charge. And therefore, we need a citywide kind of a charging infrastructure to kind of address those anxieties. And there also we have made some good progress. And I think in the coming months, we'll see a greater improvement in the numbers which we have. Already we have about 400 odd charging infrastructure points installed by the municipal corporations, and now another tender almost finalized by the Delhi government. And then we have impaneled 10 companies to allow private individuals, shopkeepers, mall owners, cinema owners to install. We are subsidizing, a substantial subsidy to the extent about 2/3 of the cost of the charger at their places, so that people can have easy access to charging infrastructure. So both fronts. And lastly, I think our push, the big push, is going to be on the electrification of buses. So we have already placed an order of 300 buses. The prototypes have arrived, and we have a plan of inducting something like 2,500 buses in the next 1.5 years. And these numbers are likely to go up to 4,000 if you look at a 3-year horizon. That is my expectation. So it's a big.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying that but net in the large picture, there is this much that government can do. A lot of effort is required from private partners, and I think companies which are especially in the business of aggregation, will soon be coming out with regulatory guidelines. Because in recent times the landscape of mobility has changed, and with companies like Ola, Uber, and even for last mile delivery, we have companies like Zomato, Swiggy, Amazon, all these companies, which is all adding up to the number of vehicles on road. Right. While it is certainly adding to consumer convenience as well, but at the same time, it's adding to the larger equation of pollution. So somewhere they need to take.
And I'd like to bring in Puneet right there, because that's exactly within the wheelhouse of what BlueSmart does. And just to kind of, from Ashish, thank you. That was very helpful to understand, especially framing it with the larger context of environmental sustainability, climate action, of course, and also this critical localized issue of, air quality that happens in Delhi every year. But Puneet, if you could talk a little bit about and sort of build on what Ashish has framed, because you're essentially one of the commercial solution providers that's trying to touch on all those aspects, right? Not just from an aggregator and a ride-hailing service, but also the proliferation of charging points and the super hubs that you mentioned. So if you could talk a little bit more about the inspiration around, how BlueSmart was conceived of and how it came together to kind of touch on all these aspects that Ashish mentioned, and also how the work that you're doing complements a lot of the work that's been done at the government level. That would be really helpful.
I think, like Ashish mentioned, I think the government of India and government of Delhi both are playing a very important role in in accelerating the adoption of electric mobility. That means public transportation at large. Like Ashish ji was mentioning, we need electric buses in cities like Delhi NCR. We need electric buses in cities like Bombay. So I think the government will really drive the electrification of public transportation. I also firmly believe, we as BlueSmart firmly believe, that it is public transportation that is also necessary to decongest a city in terms of addressing the challenges of pollution and addressing the challenges of congestion. And if we see London as an example, when we started BlueSmart, we did a lot of research on the challenges of Indian cities, challenges of Indian mega cities, and challenges of global cities like London, New York, or San Francisco. And in London, they introduced ULEZ, which is the ultra low emission zone charge, where cities, where vehicles that emit pollution, like CNG based or petrol based or diesel based, gas based vehicles, which ply on the roads of London, they need to pay a certain amount of money that equals to about 12.5 GBP per day. And that kind of congestion charge was brought in to tell people that you need to shift towards electric. There's a massive cost saving also for a London cab driver or London commercial fleet driver to shift to electric. Similarly, we believe that maybe a few months away, a few quarters away, the Delhi government or the central government also must be thinking on the lines of making certain zones of Delhi, and introducing the ultra low emission zone charge, which means, like that Ashish ji said, number of these global transportation companies and Indian transportation companies which are now starting businesses in Delhi NCR for easing the, for creating convenience for consumers, also need to now take, electric vehicles into account. Our thought process is very simple, that cities like Delhi NCR, which are one of the world's most polluted regions. So Delhi is a polluted city, but Delhi as a region, Delhi NCR region is the world's most polluted region. And like Ashish ji mentioned, that towards winter, that really the problem really accelerates like anything. And this wasn't the case 20 years back or maybe 30 years back. So I'm born in 1984. It wasn't the case then. It's only happened in the last 2 or 3 decades. And I think it's our responsibility of our generation and companies like us to really address that, to really stop this challenge. And we can do that. I think over the next decade, we really see companies like BlueSmart and others can really convert all the fleets which are non-electric to electric. And I think that problem could be solved. In terms of congestion, I think good quality public transportation like the Delhi Metro, like the Delhi buses that Ashish ji was mentioning about, at BlueSmart, our big goal is to provide a quality service to consumers, a safe, reliable, affordable, accessible, sustainable mode of transportation for people to commute from point A to point B. We believe that cabs are all season mobility. In like a two-wheeler, you can't travel distances of 40 kilometers or 50 kilometers from central Delhi to Gurgaon, maybe 30 kilometers north. But in a cab, you can safely travel long distances of 30 or 40 kilometers. So I think going forward, our firm belief is learning from the cab capital of the world, which is London. London has 140,000 taxis. It's the largest number of taxis anywhere in the world ply on the roads of London. And they have great transportation, the tube and the bus and the cabs. So I think going forward, Delhi 10 years from now should have great transportation, which is electric buses like Ashiji was mentioning about, BlueSmart cabs. Other cabs are most welcome, electric cabs, and great service from Delhi Metro. I think these will really address the big challenges of congestion, growing congestion, and the pollution problems. This is what our thought process is at BlueSmart.
Thank you, Puneet. Yeah, I think what you're highlighting quite clearly is that it's not a this or that solution, right? In other words, all of the options on the table matter, ranging from electrification of the infrastructure for private consumers, as well as broadly speaking, the mass transit system. But also looking at it again, zooming out, and I see Pawan has joined us. So welcome, Pawan. So glad you could join us. I think that I mentioned this right at the beginning, is that it's not just about technology and electric vehicles, but it's also about the way we design cities, the way we enable walking, for example, or bicycle lanes or that kind of thing. So Pawan, from your vantage point, from WRI's vantage point, if you could tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing quite broadly. All of the other panelists had an opportunity to just kind of briefly talk a little bit about their work. And so if you could fill us in about your specific role and function and the work that WRI India is doing in this space of sustainable urban mobility and eco-transportation, just to start us off with, and then I'll weave you into the conversation. That would be really helpful.
Thank you, Rajiv, and my apologies for getting delayed. When we are talking about WRI looking at transportation, for us, sustainable mobility is a key aspect of what we do, and we work with cities. And of course, Mr. Kundra is there. Our team is working, supporting Delhi on electric buses, deployment and understanding various aspects. But I think we're talking about a broad spectrum from looking at how do we make our cities safer by design, for pedestrians. And, we work very closely in Mumbai and Bangalore. We have been trying to see how we can actually improve and bring in about not just creating infrastructure, but infrastructure that is usable and that is safe for pedestrians, for bicyclists. That's one level that we work very closely. And then we also look at public transportation, which is a very big vertical and focus area for us. We believe that, bringing more people to public transportation is going to address the issues of not just congestion, but it is also from the perspective of equity and how, cities' infrastructure should be judiciously used by, everyone, all the citizens in a city. I think that's a very big point. That public transportation is extremely important, and we're talking about whether it is electric buses or we also see the BS6 buses that are being deployed, and both DHI and Mahua have really come up with policies to accelerate the adoption of buses, and we're supporting cities in terms of understanding from planning to operations to really understanding how do you really even get into contract negotiations. And then finally, I also wanted to touch a little bit upon, the philosophy that we look at is the ASI, which is the avoid, shift, and improve, which is basically that how do you really avoid trips that are really not necessary? How do you really create compact cities where you integrate urban development with transportation, where you have your growth combined with mobility? I think that's where the avoid really kicks in. And the shift is really moving towards sustainable modes. Like how do you ensure that I'm not pulling out my car to really go for 1 kilometer of really to do my errands, versus can I walk, versus can I really cycle, and can move to more sustainable almost zero emission vehicles. And then finally is the improve, where we are talking about fuel efficient modes. And that's where I think electric vehicles plays a very, very significant role. I think all these three, avoid, shift, improve, is what leads to what we are talking about: safe roads, what leads to decongestion, and what leads to zero emissions. I think that is the entire philosophy around which WRI India really looks at transportation. And we have been in India for over almost 12 years now, supporting several state governments and working very closely with CSL, Niti Aayog, several of the ministries in supporting how do we ensure better integration of transportation services.
That's great. Thank you, Pawan. Yeah, I really like that, the avoid, shift, and improve. I think that so succinctly kind of captures, in other words, the mitigation aspect of just don't, make different choices. And then with what you can change, you then move on to options that are better, more sustainable. When we had chatted, you had mentioned in some of the areas that you're working in particular. One thing you mentioned was integrated transport. And multimodal transport. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it's already been brought up in some of the comments Ashish made, with service providers like Zomato and Swiggy, and this sort of last mile delivery and connectivity aspect. Could you talk a little bit more about, WRI's perspective on that integrated multimodal landscape, and how that kind of weaves into the broader aspiration of sustainable, livable cities, mitigating air pollution issues and that kind of thing?
Yeah. I just want to define multimodal integration to just to set the context to our
Sure.
audience also, that when we talk about different modes, I think we're talking about how do we physically integrate them. I think that's one aspect, which is like physical integration. The other aspect is more about fair integration, because really looking from an end user's perspective, you really don't want a user to be really penalized just because they're switching between different modes, and their option is to really have them charged based upon their distance irrespective of mode. So how do you really talk about fair integration between different modes? I think that's second aspect. The third is really the data integration, because I think today we are in a situation where metro, buses, many modes are collecting data, but unfortunately it's just being used in silos. But how do you really bring out this data with open data uh, platforms to ensure that we're able to integrate services across both public and private transportation? And I think to a lot of extent we have seen that happen in London as a classic example, but beyond that I think it's been not so successful yet in India. And finally, when we talk about multimodal integration, knowing that transportation is a very complex subject, and it's like more than 10-15 departments are acting in a city who are responsible either in the planning process or in the operation process, you actually need to have institutional integration. And that's what sometimes we have talked about, that how do you have a UMTA, or a unified metropolitan transit authority, or a transport authority, to bring all these elements together, because there are interests of different departments and service providers, and how do you really bring this together? I think this forms the basis of how a multimodal integration looks like. Given that India has been investing in metros and buses, we see like billions of dollars right now. We have metro construction, we have more than 600 kilometers operational. Many more cities are going to join in the next few right this decade. So the question is that, do we want to just have these metros as a trunk service, which is like they just take you from point A to B, but how do you then integrate with last mile connectivity and other modes, your rickshaws, your autos, your shared mobility services, whether it is ride hailing or ride sharing? I think that becomes very, very critical, because then you have actually a very integrated system in a city, and we're truly talking about multimodal integration. The challenge we face in India is that you will have a metro, and then you will have bus stand or a bus terminal or a location which is like 400, 500 meters away, and the connectivity between both of them would be really not that great. And we have seen so many instances in Mumbai, in Bangalore, in several locations, and I think that has been one of our effort, that how do you really ensure that you are physically integrating different modes, how do you are ensuring that you are integrating the fares together. I think unless we really touch upon these specific topics and work very closely, we always talk about multimodal integration, but I think let's not forget the convenience of the end user is very critical if you want to see. And what are the benefits? You'll see higher ridership in your public transportation services. You're going to see less usage of private modes, and you will see more usage of public transportation and shared mobility. And in that process, we are trying to mitigate air pollution externalities, I think, and congestion, of course. So I think unless we really bring all these elements together, and I would always say institutional integration is extremely, extremely critical in different cities. Given all this, we know how to do it, but it's now time to really make it happen in true spirit. And then we'll start seeing that much more good examples. People would love to take public transportation. You give them open corridors connecting from one mode to another mode, make that transition easy and simple. You will see that immediately there'll be a choice that people will switch to.
No, thank you. That's really helpful, Pawan. And I want to come back to a couple of points that you made, especially in terms of institutional integration, because I'm thinking about it not just from the perspective of institutional integration in terms of multimodal systems, but also integration across the value chain, right? So when you look at the issues surrounding infrastructure around batteries, for example, and that's one of the questions that came up, but what happens to batteries at the end of their life, right? So we want to develop solutions and solution ecosystems where we're accounting for what might be the unintended consequences in a long-term fashion, especially around the use of materials and the so-called waste being generated by virtue of trying to move to more sustainable systems. But thank you, Pawan. So we'll come back to that in a second. But Smith, I wanted to, could you talk a little bit more about, how, drone technology and drones fit into this landscape of eco-transportation and sustainable mobility, and, where you see things going, especially in terms of, special use cases, like you mentioned, delivery of medicines or vaccines and that kind of thing. And is that already happening? Are there pilot projects underway? If you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv. Apologies for the earlier call. So I want to talk more from a broader aspect. So while a lot of people from a sustainability and eco-transport aspect talk about electric vehicles as such, and everyday mobility, I am looking at touching upon another point, which is support ecosystem, which is, for example, when we talk about healthcare deliveries. So when you want to use drones and you deliver medicines and vaccines, more than 7 states they conducted pilot projects in India for delivering medicines in the country. Right here, we have our own startups who are doing those projects. There we are trying to contribute on another level, where conventionally you have to stock a lot of critical medicines or blood units and near to expiry or critical sort of medical goods. Now there is some sort of predictability in the system, but not accurate. So at a lot of times you will either overstock these items at a particular place or understock them at a particular place, and there is always a demand supply gap. This is to do with critical medicines in primary healthcare centers, community healthcare centers, and the semi-urban and rural area as such. So drones come in at a place where the real use case is you put a hub. So you create a single point of cold chain storage. This is where you keep all the medicines and you keep vaccines and all the blood units. And then in a radius of about 100 kilometers, so any direction 100 kilometers, that's a huge area. you'll be able to deliver these medicines or blood units on demand. So in almost, about 30 minutes or 40 minutes or so, even after 100 kilometers, at the 100th kilometer, you'll be able to deliver it in about 45 minutes or so. So that's the kind of impact that this technology will get. Now, how does the sustainability aspect come in? If you apply this technology, you don't need to develop, maintain, and keep replenishing first the goods that you're going to store at these particular locations in the 100-kilometer radius. Also, the storage infrastructure. So you need to bring in, electricity. Then you need to keep refrigerators. Then you need to keep staff, and you need to keep, doing conventional logistics as well. All of this gets eliminated because now when you require a vaccine or you require, sort of anti-venom, which is a very critical, requirement, you wouldn't want to store anti-venom at various locations in their possibility of, having a snake bite. So all of these critical medicines can be stored at a single location, and then on demand they can be delivered at a particular point. So it's like a single hub that you create. So that's one area where drones can play an important role. Also search and rescue. So when there is a disaster, or all of these are non-conventional, use cases that I'm trying to talk about, not the typical, everyday sort of logistics that we want to replace by removing petrol cars and probably diesel cars and then bringing electric vehicles. Drones, from a sustainability perspective, will bring in a different kind of impact. So search and rescue, you have a disaster-prone area, and there is no possibility of sending in search and rescue kind of people, or it's dangerous, for example. So you will have drones that will be able to very quickly, in consuming very less resources, able to go out and sort of map the entire area and find out survivors, and map them accurately on a map, geotag them, and then conserve resources, direct them, time, energy, and the resources as well can be utilized in a more optimum way. So drones, let's say, for example, a drought-prone area, a flood-prone area where a lot of flooding has happened, you just send 2 drones or 3 drones. They map the entire area, geotag, and identify where people are stuck on roofs and all, and then you can send the response people, the first responders in that particular specific direction. Another example during disasters could be that you have a earthquake and your cellular network is down. Now you have no way to communicate or establish communication. You can put a temporary sort of cell on wings kind of a model. You have a small telecom antenna that you can hook onto a drone, and the drone can go into a particular area, and in about a 50-kilometer radius or a 40-kilometer radius, you can establish a network connectivity. So these are the kind of applications that drones will bring in. And of course, when we talk about human transportation, drones are going to play a very important role when it comes to the modern urban air mobility, which is air taxis, drone taxis that we call them. In fact, we have Indian companies that are working on these concepts. IIT Madras is playing a very important role, and we have one company recently, they raised a round of investment as well, who's probably very shortly going to showcase a first scale prototype model of a 2-seater air taxi. You will probably be able to sit inside, get a feel of how air taxi would look like. Now, this will be used for on-demand transportation, where you want to, take off from a place. Probably you don't want to spend an hour from the city to an airport in, let's say, Hyderabad or Bangalore as such. So there you can create fast, mobility corridors, and you can, transport them as well, including for critical supplies, probably organ transport and all are areas where you can build all of this, drone taxis. And looks like drone taxis will very quickly jump onto the hydrogen fuel cell concept as well from a technology perspective. At least that's what I think. So that will also play an important role. So these are the few ideas around drones and transportation of goods and people that we take.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Thank you, Smith. I do want to come back and talk a little bit more down the road about. You mentioned some of the applications that are being worked on, especially within the context of human transportation. So let's come back to that in a bit. I'm looking through some of the questions, and there's already quite a few of them. So, and I don't want to leave all of them to the end. So I'm gonna amalgamate a couple. And coming to you, Ashish, there's a couple of questions here One of them is more broad, which I think you addressed a little bit, which is along the lines of India's transportation strategy and finding that balance between the mass deployment of electric vehicle or sustainable mobility systems versus private utilization. And so you touched a little bit about things like the production link incentive as well as fiscal incentives for the adoption of these systems. Is there something you would like to add more from the standpoint of maintaining that balance where you want more utilization of public transportation and not to sort of overreach on one side where there's a massive adoption of private vehicles, but then that just adds to the problem of traffic and congestion?
Yeah, I think the only thing which I can kind of talk about, picking from what Pawan had said a little while back, is essentially the interoperability of from one mode to the other. The second thing is that public transport in cities of India, especially in Delhi, if you look at the passenger profile, it is not typically people who you want to shift to buses or to the metro. So while in metro, the adoption amongst the youth has still been, I think, better. But in case of buses, still it's not considered cool to travel in buses in India. While the same set of people, when they go to London, they'll readily hop onto a London bus. But the Delhi bus, even though it might be air conditioned, it might be free or it might be hugely subsidized. But people are reluctant. One reason is, of course, that Delhi and other cities of India, buses tend to kind of go on fixed routes with fixed stoppages. It's not service on demand. So I think if we switch to now, models where bus aggregators also come into play, and we are kind of looking at that opportunity in the city transportation space, and also particularly from the satellite towns of Delhi. Noida, Ghaziabad, Gurgaon, Faridabad, even Sonipat, people come every day to work. And if they have predictable kind of transportation solutions which are affordable and which are convenient, which are comfortable, I think people will make that shift substantially. But for the time being, we need to add buses, we need to strengthen the metro, and we need to encourage people to make that shift apart from whatever else I just mentioned.
No, you're absolutely right. And Ashish, I want to stay with you just for another piece of this, and then and Puneet, feel free to jump in because one of the questions that came in was around things like battery life, right? And this is the point that I mentioned when Pawan was talking to, is sort of the broader ecosystem integration from the standpoint of the overall value chain, which is to say now you've got a massive fleet of electric vehicles. I mean, more than a fleet. If that just becomes the mainstream, most electric vehicles or all of them have batteries. And so the question is, what do you do from the standpoint of managing the fact that batteries have a lifespan, and then what do you do with the batteries that are coming out of the system in terms of they're no longer meeting efficiency and operation requirements? And what does that world look like? The world of manufacturing and battery recovery, recycling, remanufacturing. Is that something you could touch on a little bit, Ashish? And then, of course, Puneet, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so I think this entire space is undergoing a lot of change, a lot of transformation. And I think the analogy which comes to my mind is that of mobile cellular phones. 20 years ago, cell phone technology also was expensive. It was also, the battery issues were there. It was a heavy, bulky, unwieldy equipment. Now you have everything on phone, battery life is better, etc., etc. So there are a lot of companies which are engaged in R&D in the battery space, to de-risk the supply chain dependency on China, and I think B, to improve battery life. Government of India is pushing also on indigenous battery manufacture solutions. Of course, the current limitation is that the battery production as such is based on the rare earths, which are, limited to a certain geographical region in the world. But there are parallel concurrent research happening on how we can overcome those barriers. And as far as the range issue is concerned, I think to begin with, electric vehicle adoption will be attractive to those people whose commute is in urban spaces, in larger metropolitan areas, where every day they are traveling, 100, 150 kilometers, like that. As it is, the economics works out very well. If you look at two-wheelers and three-wheelers, between an ICE kind of a solution and an EV, the economics even now works out much better. It is only in the four-wheeler space that it is slightly more expensive now, but things are changing. But even there, I think if we look at the corporate fleets, which are commuting people from one place to the other, from their residences to offices, etc., I think these are going to be very, very attractive propositions. In as far as battery recycling is concerned, I think that ecosystem is developing, standards are being set. So, this is a space where disruption has happened much faster than regulation. And regulation is kind of still taking shape in a lot of spaces. Standards are being set. For example, charging infrastructure, the battery technology itself for buses, the standards are still stabilizing. So there is no uniformity. They are not interoperable. So you buy one car and, the same charging infrastructure can't be used for another car. So it's a challenge, but I think things will kind of settle down on that space pretty soon.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ashish.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So my thoughts are, like Ashish ji also mentioned, I think the range of the car has really increased. So the first set of cars, if we look back, the car that we got on board on the platform of BlueSmart, we started with 70 cars. The CEO of Niti Aayog India launched us on 4th of June 2019. We had a fleet of then 70 cars, which had a range of about 140 odd kilometers. Today, if I look at my current fleet, it has cars of north of 300 kilometers. We are inducting a lot of cars which are north of 200 kilometers, north of 300 kilometers on a single charge. And we believe that with each passing quarter, each passing year, we will see a significant increase in the range of cars. Like Ashiji mentioned, we had mobile phones back in early 90s, and I used to go to college and I used to keep a spare battery in my pocket because I used to change the battery of that particular mobile company because it required change of battery after 3 hours. And today with new smartphones or whatever brands, you don't need to change your battery. The battery remains inside the phone. Your habits have changed, and with regards to the use of your use, you can keep charging the phone a number of times. Similarly, if we see in public transportation, the likes of BlueSmart or Ola or Uber, any cab service for that matter doesn't for intracity operations doesn't operate more than 220 kilometers. So that fear or anxiety around charging is absolutely not there. We also believe that with this EV super hub that we have created, we have EV super hubs at all strategic locations in Gurgaon, South Delhi and others. We see that you can easily achieve cab companies can easily achieve that number of 220 plus kilometers with charging at those strategic locations. And when the cars reach north of 240, 250 kilometers, we placed an order for 4,000 cars on Tata Motors 3 months back. And all the new set of cars that we are getting from Tata Motors are now north of 220 kilometers. So with each passing year, that range issue will go. In terms of battery, like even Ashish ji touched upon, I think battery has a second life. We're doing a lot of research here. New chemistries are being worked upon globally. The best part about EVs is that your total cost of operations keeps getting better if you shift from life 1 to life 2 of the car. And also what has happened for the first time in country like India over the last 4 or 5 years is that the cost of alternate fuel or the mainstay fuel has really gone up. So the cost of CNG, it was about 38 rupees a kg in Delhi in 2016, and that numbers today nearly 60 rupees a kg. So we have seen an increase of 50% in the cost of CNG, and we have seen an increase of 100% in the cost of petrol and diesel. So petrol and diesel was about 69 rupees a liter in 2016 circa, And today that cost has gone to about 110 rupees, 120 now. Government give a subsidy of 10 rupees, so 110 rupees a liter. For us, if we do unit economics, we firmly believe that any commercial operator running on CNG or petrol or diesel, it will not make sense. You have to eventually shift towards electric. I think Delhi is one of the best EV policies in the world. And I think what London is doing in London, Delhi is doing in Asia, in APAC region. And I think cities like London and Delhi will show the world that shifting towards electric mobility is very, very important for public transportation to begin with. But going forward in the next half a decade, all modes of transportation, consumer centric, private or public, will eventually shift towards electric.
No, that's great. Thank you. You mentioned, and you ended on a perfect note as you talked about, the consumer-centric side of things. And one of the questions that came in, and this is something that I want to bring Pawan into as well, in terms of the post-pandemic world, with safety being on people's minds, and a year or so ago, I talked to some folks from the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, and one of the things that they mentioned was that they'd seen an increase in the purchase of second vehicles because there was a limited amount of public transit available at the time, and there was just this safety concern about using or being out in public spaces in either public transport or carpooling. So how has that affected the landscape of what you're seeing through BlueSmart? In terms of shared mobility services, is that post-pandemic consumer behavior any different, or if it's different, what kind of factors are coming into play to keep them engaged in using these platforms?
So I think in terms of BlueSmart, we have been very, careful from day one. In terms of, in fact, we were born in a COVID era. So we started in June 19, and just 8 months of operation, pandemic hit. But as a BlueSmart consumer on the BlueSmart app, you can see the body temperature of the driver who's driving the car, which is the first feature in the ride-hailing service in the world. As a consumer of BlueSmart, you can see the last time of car sanitization, which is on the consumer app, which is again an industry-first feature. No company did that in India or globally we know of. So these are features which give you that confidence to use a clean and sanitized car. You can see the body temperature of the driver partner. You can see the last time of car sanitization. Also, we were really not promoting ride sharing so much because we were also of the belief that sharing a ride with somebody you don't know, you can do that in a bus, but in the car, we found it pretty unsafe. We also wanted to create a safety product, a safe product for women. So if you see our cohorts, 42% of all consumers, we have served 1 million, trips till now. So 1 million customers have used BlueSmart, over 350,000 app downloads with an App Store rating of 4.9. But 42% of all consumers in Delhi NCR of BlueSmart are women. And that just goes to show that we have created a very safe ride-hailing experience for women. We have panic buttons installed in the car, which is mandatory. The Delhi High Court said that every cab operator in Delhi should have panic buttons installed, 4 of them, 3 for the consumer, 1 for the driver. But we see that other cab operators, I don't know for what reason, don't have them. They would be knowing more. But we have panic buttons installed. We track each car after it leaves the BlueSmart hub, similar to the way ATC tracks the aeroplanes after it's airborne. We track the car. So not only we track our cars through the consumer app, through the driver app, but also we have tracking devices installed in the car. So at any given point of time, safety is critical. And our lead investor is BP Ventures from London, which is also, their main mission is to provide safety to consumers. So our main mission is to provide safe ride-hailing, safe, mobility, safe experience to consumers. They can travel anywhere in Delhi NCR. 1 passenger, 2 or 3. I think in the current COVID guidelines, not more than 2 people can travel in the car any given point of time as per the current COVID protocol. But our overarching theme is to provide a safe experience to consumers. And on the consumer app, they can see all these safety features, which give them the confidence to use a BlueSmart in these times also.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, Pawan, I thank you. I see you sort of answered a couple of the questions in the chat. Thank you for doing that. But could you sort of talk a little bit about, from your vantage point, what you're seeing in this sort of pandemic or post-pandemic era, how that's impacting, transport, urban mobility, especially the adoption of sustainable transport systems and options, and what the consumer sense and feel is, and how we can nudge them along a little bit. I say them, ultimately it's all of us. Yeah.
So I think clearly couple of things, right? We have seen private vehicle ownership go up, and for obvious reasons, because of the need for COVID appropriate behavior and safety concerns, that we see a lot of pent up demand for two wheelers, and Indian cities are typically very two wheeler dependent. We have also seen that public transportation services almost crash, but again bounce back. But every wave that has come really has been quite demoralizing for public transportation, because you don't see, I mean, they need to be supported by state government and central government, because they don't have any other option for funding, because the fare box revenue that they have would be good enough for just operations. And you have buses that are aging, and the fleet upgradation needs to happen. So, but I also see this as an opportunity, that electric buses, how they can play an important role in ensuring that they could really be incorporated into the fleet services. But I think a lot more needs to really happen in terms of financing. I think that's a very it's a topic that's not really touched upon. We need to really explore alternative financing mechanisms also, where the state transport undertakings, which are extremely dependent upon state governments for any kind of support, really need to really see how they can really do, because it's not possible for them to say that, hey, we are going to raise our fare and we are going to do whatever we like. We need to understand that public transportation is a public good, and there is very much dictated by the politics, and it is very much dictated by, people need those kind of services. There's a huge section of society that would never be able to afford a private vehicle. So I think let's keep that in mind, that we need to address that. And I think that seriously, through electric buses, I see as an opportunity. It's been extremely a very bleeding situation for all the STUs. They were already working under a lot of stress, and now it's even more stressful. And to tell them that, become make profitable doesn't make sense, because there's no public agency in the world where profit is the motto. It should never be. So I would really say that has happened. We really need to, I would say, encourage shared mobility and encourage mass transportation adoptions. And I would say that hopefully, and it's really a hope, with the new variants really becoming a little bit lesser virulent, the hope is that public transportation services would really bounce back. In fact, there were studies done. It was seen that actually buses were considered very safe. You have, in at least in wave one and wave two, post really after that. So I would really say that um, important, these are the trends we are seeing. One more trend that we have seen, I was talking about, which I typed also, is that we have seen huge investment, almost 1 billion USD in the last 3 years, which is like through pandemic. And just echoing what Punit was also saying, that a lot of startups are really talking about scaling up. We have also seen manufacturing setups coming up. We are also talking about existing business models being questioned, and many of them actually have literally crashed in your ride sharing and ride hailing services. And we're talking about new business models which is being driven by EVs. And we also need to understand, EVs means it's also about data. So I think these are some of the general trends that we are seeing specifically in transportation. We also see that many of the government agencies becoming very conscious about this whole climate angle, because I think post COP26, even prior to that, we see very proactive. We have been working with Mr. Kundra for last several months. The kind of proactiveness that we have seen in his leadership and the team, we're seeing across many other cities where they really want to ensure that electric buses are being deployed. They're also talking about how do we ensure, even whether it is electric rickshaws or shared mobility services, how do we ensure that we accelerate those adoption. And pretty soon we will also have the national hydrogen energy mission, which will be launched. It's probably a matter of couple of weeks or months, where the government is and MNRE is really coming up with this policy, which will really ensure decarbonization. Of course, it will talk about transportation sector, but it's much more broader. But I think we'll also see a lot more momentum there in long haul vehicles, in the freight sector, and also in shipping. So I think broadly, if you're asking me what are the trends, what are the changes in the COVID, I would say, innovation has picked up. Public transportation needs to rebound. We see huge uptake and momentum in EVs. I think it was last year we saw EVs almost being 3 times or 4 times of what was, the vehicles actually almost quadrupled of what the demand or what was the vehicles sold in 2020. And fifth is, of course, the hydrogen mission coming. So I would really say, these are some of the big changes and trends we are seeing in post-COVID world. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Pawan. That's great. And I actually want to pick up on what you mentioned in terms of innovation and disruption, which I think is kind of where, coming to you, Smith, that's kind of the space in which the drone universe is, right, within India, is that it's not sort of fully flowered or unfolded into outright commercial applications, but it's on that cusp where there's probably a need for investment, a need for some risk taking, certainly a need for interventions that you're involved in from the standpoint of advocacy and getting folks in the public policy sphere in particular to kind of understand what the opportunities are and what some of the limitations might be as well. Could you tell us a little bit more, like what are you seeing in terms of, you mentioned, and it's amazing to know about those special use scenarios, right, in terms of, healthcare, delivery of medications, etc., and search and rescue, but sort of putting the lens on urban mobility, that sounds, it sounds quite impressive, and really to think about it from the perspective of the kind of infrastructure, the kind of oversight that would be needed to transport people in the urban environment. What does that world look like? Like, where are we with that in India, or even globally? What might be some good benchmarks of countries or cities that are looking at this in a real application-oriented way to move people around?
So thanks, Rajiv. I think the classic use case demonstration has happened in China and very soon in Dubai as well. There's a company called eHang that has started giving joy rides to people in drone taxis. Two people can hop on and just take the. This is more from a adoption perspective. People are really scared in sitting in airplanes or helicopters as well. What about you sitting in an helicopter with no pilot? So that's the kind of thing. So there is the technology has been proved, maybe not at the economical side, but drone taxis are real. They are in place. Companies have started building there are more than 20 successful projects across the world, probably more than 50 more in pipeline, and all of them have delivered vehicles that can either take off from everyday street or may require a special area, not as clear and as big as a helipad, but something which is more dedicated as such. So that technology is there. The next step will be about how do we create the ground infrastructure. So let's say if we talk about cities like Bangalore or Hyderabad, probably I'll just from an Indian mentality perspective, I would say, why would you want to pay for sitting in a drone taxi that's going to be slightly more expensive? Probably because you want to reach very quickly from the city to an airport, or you're delivering something, or you're taking up activity that is critical in nature. So either you want to save time, or you want to sort of ensure safety of the good that you're trying to transport. So we need to build a dedicated infrastructure for all of this, just like we're trying to put in the EV chargers to support the electric vehicles on the ground. There will be dedicated spaces that will need to be put up to make sure that the drone taxis can land, and all of this, just like the EV space, is something that needs to be bet upon. So it's like a chicken and egg story, right? You can't really say that, okay, when will we have drones delivering critical medicines? When will we have drones transporting humans? Well, it'll only happen once a large government use case comes in, or some private investment comes in, and they bet on the technology early on, so that they can continue to sustain the innovation, and they can mature the technology to the point that now the technology and the user can sort of run it in a cycle. So there will need to be, apart from innovation, there will need to be a lot of cash that will need to be pumped into this sector as well. That will actually help accelerate the maturity of the technology and take it to economies of scale. So that is something that we need to look at. And the most important use case would be, let's say, for example, there's a very funny use case that we talk about in the drone industry. when do you think pizza will be delivered at your house? So the problem is not actually with the drone and the pizza, but it is more with the city planning and the infrastructure. If I try to deliver a medicine or a pizza at your house, I will first have navigation issues in terms of finding your house and locating it on a 2D or a 3D. First on a 2D map, then on a 3D map, and then I will have a tough time making the drone reach to your house because there are so many overhead cables and unplanned, sort of trees and various other obstructions coming in. So those are the things that we need to also think of. Imagine roads becoming 3D. So you'll have not just the ground level 1 of the roads or the level 0, but there will be multiple corridors and roads that will come up in the air as well. So we need to plan for that. We need to develop our city infrastructure to accommodate all of that. Otherwise, we'll keep talking about drone taxis and drone deliveries and nothing will happen, because there'll just be some POCs and some very expensive trials, but that will not lead to very sustainable, economical sort of operations. So all of that needs to be brought in the considerations.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, one thing that comes through loud and clear, Smith, as you're talking, is there's certainly a need to de-risk some of this, especially from the perspective of investment, and maybe the government has a role to play, and also just the overall planning piece of it, right? From an infrastructure point of view, which even Pawan has talked about. So, and this is kind of the exciting opportunity. This is completely stakeholder driven, or should be, which is to say all groups need to be talking to each other from the standpoint of design and delivery and optimization of these unique systems. Ashish, any thoughts about or any chatter or reflections on what's been happening within the government from the standpoint of where drone technology or drones sit in the mix of things?
Well, I think it's an idea which is yet to take some maturity. But I mean, from listening to what was just mentioned, I mean, what I can think is, what I just had to flag is also apart from the investment risk is the regulatory risk, because the airspace is kind of, we have got the regulators which are, depending on the numbers of such vehicles which will be used. So at some point there will be some that needs to be addressed. That's what I'm saying. And obviously the Ministry of Civil Aviation and the DGCA and all those bodies which are into this space will have to. And I think there is a lot of consultation which is happening actually, but it is yet to gather that momentum where it appears to be as real as a drone taxi. That's where it is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's many moving pieces to this, which and it's exciting to see the work that Smith and the Drone Federation are doing. And maybe after this conversation today, maybe there can be more discussion on how some of this can be integrated, especially from a long-term vision of sustainable development. I think the special use cases certainly make a very compelling case in my mind. On the topic of technology, Ashish, when you and I had chatted the other day, you talked about these conversion kits going from internal combustion engines to electric. Could you talk a little bit more about how that's being rolled out and deployed? Because we talk about electric vehicles, and I think the common perception is that, oh, you've got to buy an electric vehicle, but clearly there's another pathway of switching to electric versus simply purchasing a new vehicle.
Yeah, so the deal is this, that in Delhi the regulatory environment is also circumscribed by various court pronouncements from time to time. And one of the key judgments is that diesel vehicles which are beyond 10 years life and petrol vehicles which are beyond 15 years can't ply on the roads of Delhi, in fact in the NCR. So what we have done is that on the one side we have kind of deregistered more than 1 lakh diesel vehicles on 1st January this year automatically from the database. That means it is if they are caught plying, they'll be straight away sent to the scrappers. So and I think the next step will be for petrol vehicles which are beyond 15 years. But we are giving an option to people to kind of convert them to electric. And so far, there is a limited number of companies, about 10 odd companies, which are kind of empaneled with the ICAT and the RAI, which are the regulatory bodies which certify the conversion kits. So we have kind of notified them on our website, and people can kind of get them converted. The cost of conversion is, of course, is not that economical. And number two is it's not universal for all vehicles. I mean, kits are yet to evolve for certain kinds of vehicles. But having said that, I think if Delhi, because we are the first actually state to roll this out in this fashion, to give a regulatory push for conversions. And if you look at the numbers, in Delhi alone, petrol vehicles which are more than 15 years are 3 million. And it's a very large number. So not only are you giving a captive market to potential startups and companies which are into this kit business, but also an opportunity for people, that they may have kind of kept their vehicles in reasonably good condition. They don't want to part with it. They don't want to get it scrapped, but they can get it converted. So my expectation is that the cost is also going to come down. We are soon going to have a dialogue, with the companies which are engaged in this business, and maybe have a hackathon around it, so that we encourage investors to come into this space and start converting traditional ICE engine vehicles which are nearing the end of life, so that they can be used for a longer duration.
No, that's very exciting. Thank you. So I see Asad is back. So that's my cue that it's time to start winding down. Yeah. Maybe five or 6 minutes more, Asad. Is that good? Yeah, great. So yeah, I know this has been such a fascinating conversation. I really want to thank each of you for joining us, for sharing your perspective. And as we're coming to a close here, what I want to ask each of you is maybe, just a few reflections on the future. We're into the new year. The vision of long-term sustainable development is one that spans decades into the future. And so where do you see the work that you're doing specifically, or more generally, the space of sustainable urban mobility and eco-transportation going? So if you could share just a few thoughts, orienting us towards the journey ahead, and in whatever fashion you see fit. So Puneet, I'll come to you first. I think BlueSmart is such an exciting venture overall, and there's such great potential. So maybe you could start us off with where you see things going, maybe BlueSmart specifically, as well as broadly the space of eco-transportation.
No, I think what we think now with each passing year and each passing quarter is that this decade now it's a lot about sustainability. I mean, people were talking of EVs even when we were writing a white paper somewhere back in 2016, 17. It did not make sense to invest in EVs. The capital cost of EVs were very high. But now going forward, as the capital cost has come down with great help from the central government, from the Delhi government, the cost of alternate fuel has really gone up. It makes total unit economic sense for us to use EVs, which means that we can scale our fleet. But now coming back to the bigger problem, the people of Delhi today and other mega cities also want to change, and they want to live in a cleaner world, healthier world. The fact is, whether you are a rich man or a poor man, everybody breathes the same quality of air in Delhi. So the denominator is the same for everybody. It doesn't matter how rich you are or how poor you are, you get the same air in your nose. So I think this year or this decade going forward is about that change, and companies like BlueSmart can do a bit, but I think as a society, we all need to contribute. We all need to change the way we move around in Delhi NCR for a better tomorrow. And this is what we want to do at BlueSmart. Starting with Delhi NCR, we're also now scaling to other parts of India. We've raised substantial funding, which allows us to scale to north of 10,000 cars over the next 2 years. But this is where we also encourage, like Ashish was mentioning, we need to encourage everybody in the ecosystem to come forward and do that. We also encourage our competitors, some new companies which are thinking on the line of BlueSmart, but everybody should now move towards sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a solo sport. It's a stakeholder sport for sure. Pawan, when you and I had chatted, thank you, Puneet. Pawan, when you and I had chatted, you had mentioned this very important and often overlooked aspect of the just transition, which is part of the wheelhouse of environmental justice, climate justice. And one of the questions that was also in the chat was reminded me of it, and the question was, what steps are the panelists or respective organizations taking to ensure that their design is accessible to disabled people, for example, which is again within that wheelhouse of a just transition. I'd love to hear your thoughts and or WRI India's perspective on this whole which I really feel is often overlooked, right? Because sustainability is not just environmental or economic. It's ultimately it's about people, and it's about coherence and coexistence in a harmonious way. So, could you talk a little bit about this just transition? I said this just transition, the just transition point of view. Yeah.
No, I think that's a very interesting point that you raised, Rajiv, that just transition. I think when every technology transition happens, I think we really need to understand that, is this transition going to be equitable? And, is there a factor of, ensuring that um, this transition is really not just beneficial in terms of certain people who are just availing the services or who are going to use, but how is it really going to impact across the entire value chain? And I think that's where it really talks about. I don't think we have really had much discussion per se in Indian context, but I think as we go through this technology transition for over next decade and so and beyond, I think it will be really important that factors of ensuring that people who how are we really ensuring that people who are in job today, how are we ensuring their skill development and ensuring that they are ready for adopting the new technology, and how do we really bring that it's not just about skill development, you understand, it's like we're going to see three
Yep.
things happen, right, as we move from ICE to EVs and other technology transitions, that will have people who are likely to really lose their new opportunities. There will be people where jobs will be lost, there will be people where jobs will be created, where people you can really fit them. So I think we really need to think through at a system level to ensure that okay, we know that we're able to move certain people in this new technology transition, and what do we really do about it to ensure that it's really taken care, and really to taking this opportunity even to bring the lens of gender and leave no one behind. I think it's really really important we all understand that how it can significantly contribute to GDP growth. It's just not about economic opportunity, but it is also bringing that social stability and ensuring that people from all shades of society are able to really embrace the transition equally. It's not just about only innovation, but it is about also touching in this society strata from a socio-economic perspective. How is it really impacting? Because we
Yeah.
just think that the systems are in silos, but when you really look from a system design and systems approach, you see that everyone is going to be impacted. And
Yeah.
how do we ensure this transition is really literally just for each
Yeah.
one of us? I think that's really important, and we need to have a lot more conversations. We need to have frameworks that will ensure that technology companies and governments are really bringing these policies and ensure that everyone is included in this transition.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would
Exactly.
leave it
I
with
think.
just that thought, because I think a lot more needs to be done.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You mentioned inclusiveness. I mean, you mentioned gender. Obviously, not just gender, but even differently abled or disabled people. I mean, it's part of that spectrum of inclusive and sustainable development, right? Which is a frame of reference that's often talked about by the UNIDO office in India, and they recently launched their FIC ISID unit as well. So I think you're right on in terms of thinking about it from a broad vantage point, not just as consumers, but as society as a whole. You also mentioned skill development, and Smith, that's something that you talked about in terms of the where the future lies from a drone industry and drone technology perspective. Where do you see things going in the next decade or longer, or what would you like to see happen in this space?
So I think drone technology will really take transportation. The conventional transportation is currently, I believe, in just three layers: the surface transport, the underground transport, and the air transport. Drone technology will make this multi-layer. So you'll not just have, uh, uh, currently you have planes that do fly, but they generally fly in a class of airspace and usually on fixed routes. What drone technology will do is bring in transportation of goods and people and make transportation really multi-layered. And in fact, there are concepts like unmanned traffic management systems. I think that was being referred earlier in the discussion of how so many vehicles and so many aerial vehicles will actually be, flying in sync or will be, talking to each other. So there are automated, traffic management systems, software based, that will come in and that will actually, manage all of this very seamlessly, automatically. So you'll really have, when I was growing up, I had a cartoon that I used to see, the Jetsons. You hop onto a vehicle and then you fly. That is something that this decade or probably the next 2 decades will bring in as a reality in every part of the country and the world. So that's what I think this decade is going to lay the foundation for.
That's exciting. I mean, if you've got a drone that folds up into a suitcase, Smith, count me in. I'll be the first to buy. Awesome. Well, Ashish, the last word goes to you. Thank you again for joining us. It would be lovely to hear what your thoughts are as we kind of embark into 2022 and the hopes and optimism for the next decade.
I think we are at a remarkable inflection point. There is huge optimism, and I think the signs are very, very encouraging. Number one, if I have to mention that from the government standpoint, for the first time, I am seeing not only a harmonization of policies across states and at the national level. It is everybody, there's a unity of purpose for making this switch from conventional fuels to electric. It is unprecedented. And I can give the example of CNG. When that transition happened, Delhi was alone and other cities and states didn't follow. However, in this case, what is heartening is that there is a very healthy competition among states. Each one is coming out with more progressive policies to attract investments, to encourage consumers to make that switch, and to create a more wholesome regulatory environment. So that sign is very, very positive. I think what we need to do now is to stitch up an alliance which is sustainable, which brings private sector as equal partners and maybe a larger stakeholders actually for greater, faster, and a deeper adoption. They could be startups, they could be established players, they could be a whole variety. The size of the pie is so large, it can accommodate everybody. So I think I'm very optimistic as we start this year.
That's great. That's such a great thing to hear. And I think a great note to end on as well. So thank you again, all of you, Pavan, Smith, Puneet, and Ashish, for joining us, for sharing your views and your vantage point, and also for going deep in some areas and also touching on some of the social aspects, which I think are sometimes easily forgotten or ignored, when we look at it purely from a technology or economic perspective. So with that, I will pass it back over to Asad. And Asad, all yours.
Thank you. I mean, what an honor to have a panel of game changers. Each of you all are putting India on the road to eco-transportation. A big thank you to Ashish, Puneet, Pavan, Schmidt, and Rajiv for such a fascinating discussion. And a big shout out, Rajiv, for so skillfully moderating this session. And most of all, to our audiences for tuning in. We're so encouraged by the support. Yes, we have transitioned into this online space for now, and we hopefully be back doing this in a physical space. But every week, we have them coming back. And, this is a topic very close to my heart. We launched this series. We've launched a website, which is sustainablynow.in, which archives all our programs. And we encourage all our audiences to come back and see the different topics that we use the arts platform to bring, to highlight issues of today. And, Firstly, I really believe in arts for social change, and we use this as something to kind of create a difference, hopefully. So do stay in touch, follow us, stalk us on social media at Avid Learning or our website for the next program. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and remember that learning never stops. Thank you once again and have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.